Oh, we are live in the Asia Tech Podcast studio. This is Asia Matters and the foursome that I have presented to you tonight. Myself, Graham Brown. Introduce yourself, sir.
I am Teymoor Nabili.
Teymoor Nabili.
Simon Kemp. And Scott Bales.
Scott Bales. Excellent. So we are here to discuss the big issues of the day in Asia. We're qualified to discuss these, obviously. So what we're going to do, a bit of entertainment, a bit of serious news as well. We're going to talk about why Asia matters and what's going on in Asia right now. So anything that's crossing your social media feed, we're going to analyse it and tell you what you need to know. What matters.
Anything, really?
Everything and anything.
It's a broad palette.
It is a broad palette, but that's how it runs, right? Okay? Good. Starting with you, Teymoor. Biggest news in Asia this week is Crazy Rich Asians. So maybe before we dive into the news, let's talk about what's going on. Let's have a look at maybe the video as well. Maybe we can flash that up and get a sample of what this is all about. Crazy Rich Asians. Who's actually seen this so far?
I saw it last night.
Rich, we've been dating for over a year now, and I think it's about time people met my beautiful girlfriend. What about us taking an adventure east?
Like Queens?
Singapore, Colin's wedding.
Here we go.
Family.
I hardly know anything about them. Every time I bring them up, Nick changes the subject. Maybe his parents are poor and he has to send them money.
I'll take a bags and get you checked into first class.
Nick, we can't afford this. So your family is rich?
We're comfortable.
That is exactly what a super rich person would say.
I want money.
1.2 million.
That's what I want.
The Nick you're dating is Nick Young?
Yeah, you guys know them or something?
Hells yeah. They're just the biggest developers in all of Singapore.
That's what I
Damn, Rachel. It's like the Asian Bachelor.
These people aren't just rich. They're crazy rich.
Oh, you really should have told me that you're like the Prince William of Asia.
That's ridiculous. Much more of a Harry. Mom, this is Rachel Chu.
She just thinks you're some like
So what's the verdict on this
banana.
movie, Teymour?
I'm not here to do a film review.
Yellow
mate.
Yeah, go on.
outside.
Do the film room. Come on. So why did you bring this to our attention? Why is this an important subject for Asia
Well,
Matters
because
this
everyone's
week?
been talking about it.
Yeah.
There's been this big hoo-ha in Singapore that actually they've presented it as a Singapore film, but it's not actually a Singapore film, insofar as all that really represents Singapore are a few landmarks. A lot of it was filmed in Malaysia, a lot of it was filmed elsewhere. And also, it doesn't represent Singapore outside of the Chinese community. There are no brown faces, there are no Malaysian faces, Indian faces, anything like that. And so people are a little bit worried about the political correctness of calling it an Asian movie, where in fact the only people that are being seen here are Singapore Chinese. So it's been a talking point, which I thought was interesting. But then I went to see the film last night, and that wasn't the first thing that struck me. The opening scene was hilarious because you have this wealthy Chinese family walking into a hotel in London, which is the Ritz rebranded. It's the Ritz Hotel. And what happens is they're greeted with openly racist attitudes. I mean, basically the hotel tells them to go away because they're Chinese.
What, in London?
In London, and this is in the 20th century.
I'm assuming this is fictional.
It turns out, well, of course, it's a novel. Right? Well, it's a book. But it's interesting that they think that in the modern day and age that, I'm not saying racism doesn't exist, but that a wealthy Chinese family would walk into a hotel in London and be told to leave because
I do find
because
it
they
greatly
should be in
ironic.
Chinatown. It was hilarious. And throughout the film, there's this like, subtle undercurrent of really, having a few sharp digs at the Western races.
The company that made this movie is based in...
Actually, I don't know where it was produced.
I believe it's a Hollywood.
Well, I mean, it was
I know,
the money came out of Hollywood, I
I
think.
do find it.
But the guy who
gently
wrote it is a Singapore Chinese guy.
There's a gentle irony to the idea that Hollywood telling people in the UK that they're racist. But there we go. Let's not touch that one for
But
now.
so a lot of the conversation around why are there no non-Chinese Asian faces in this film, and I thought that was a little bit overdone, to be honest, because the film was a cheesy Hollywood romance, mainstream pick. It wasn't there to depict the realities of Asia. It was to tell a cheesy love story in a certain set of circumstances.
So why did
that's my film review.
did you vote for that as the top story of the week?
I didn't vote for that. I presented
resist.
it as something that we could talk about.
Right.
So the top story of the week, as far as I'm concerned, is completely different. But
Right. But with
allow
that-
the others to have a word.
Yeah, well, let's go back to Crazy Rich Asians.
Yeah,
but
I think-
did people say it put Singapore on the map? Did it work for you? Did it put Singapore on the map?
Well, I knew where Singapore was, but no. I mean, look, it had some nice landmarks. It did give you a flavour of maybe Singapore culture and the way people do things here.
It's a very interesting follow-up to the Trump-Kim summit.
Right, yeah, exactly.
We're on a roll from a PR perspective.
Yeah.
But I'm really interested in your take on it. I think the fact that it became a story about racial representation, whether it's in the US, and this is the first time that the Asian community in the US has been depicted in a movie, and the fact that the whole of that sort of East Asian community has embraced the movie as being their own, even if it's about Singapore, which I just find fascinating. To then have the conversations that are taking place now of this is not representative of the racial mix that is within Singapore. And I appreciate that once again we have the irony of us being four white guys sitting talking about Asia. But I just find it really interesting that that's where that conversation ended up. We almost always get to the situation where we're looking for a negative instead of celebrating the fact that this is definitely an improvement on what would have happened.
Well done,
a
Simon.
few decades
Keeping
back.
it positive.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure that all the reaction was negative. I went to an event last week. Actually, I didn't go to the event. I happened to be at the Straits Clan Club last week. I don't know if
You gate crashed, didn't you?
I was there having a meeting, as a matter of fact, and they actually had the director and the star, whose name I now forget, who is in fact a Singaporean guy, doing a little Q&A. And the place was mobbed. I mean, there was like a lot of people had turned up for this event, dressed up in their finery, because it was about rich people, of course, so you can't turn up looking like a pauper. And, there was a lot of interest and excitement about it. So it wasn't all negative. I mean, a lot of people were engaged by it, including my wife, which is why I went to see it last night, because I wouldn't.
But in that case, then, is it really about Asian culture or just pop culture in general?
It's about all sorts of those cultural memes that people enjoy, right?
Do you think that there comes a time in like a country or a population's development when they're interested in what other people think of them? Up until that point, they're pretty much just getting on with their thing, but there comes a time when they're starting to get internationalized, so they start to sort of be curious about how the world perceives them.
And so this is important. So this has been come up a couple of times on listening to radio and taxis in the last few days. A lot of the conversation, the debate we're having is very similar to how basically how the black community was basically portrayed when Boys in the Hood first came out.
Right.
Like it's a story about something within some representative of their community, and everyone, this isn't representative of everyone. And that I struggle as to why we've gone down, like I was saying, why have we gone down this angle? It's just a story.
This is probably massively inappropriate. I'll get hate mail for this, but
Simon, do it.
Being a Scotsman, where the representation of my cultural history was we had an Australian guy play one of our greatest national heroes, which was Mel Gibson in Braveheart.
and that get the story wrong.
Exactly. I was going to come on to the fact that not only that, but they completely bastardized the story as well. I think Hollywood has a long heritage of corrupting other people's stories. And I think from what I've understood, I haven't seen the movie yet, so I can't comment with great accuracy, but from what I can understand, it's not like it was in any way derogatory. It was perhaps articulating one aspect of Singapore culture, but movies' jobs is not to do the Singapore Tourism Board's job, and admittedly the Singapore Tourism Board generally does a pretty good job of telling the world what Singapore is about. Movies are there for our entertainment. I just find it odd that we've decided that there has to be an incredibly sort of succinct representation, a microcosm of the entire world of Asia. And then we talk about Asia as though it's one place. This is one of the other things that fascinates me. When you get a Western, especially when you get an American audience talking about Asia as though it's a country. I appreciate it's not just an Asian thing. This happens in Africa as well. But more than half of the world's population lives here. I admit, when I moved to Singapore, for the first week that I lived here, I could not show you where it was on the map. I had no idea. I mean, I'd fallen in love with the place, but it took me a while to know exactly where it was on the map. And even to this day, it's like...
Do your mates know back home?
The number of conversations I have when I go back to the UK where people still think that Singapore is an island just off China. And, to be honest, why would you know?
Isn't it?
Yeah, technically, yes.
But then, if I asked you where is Senegal on the sort of the outline of Africa, putting a map pin in that for a lot of people that don't live in that part of the world is going to be difficult. So I think it's unrealistic to expect that the rest of the world knows the things that you know just because you live there. Because until I moved here, I didn't. So, I find it interesting that...
But they couldn't really call it, crazy rich denizens of a very small dot.
The red dot doesn't mean anything to anybody.
Yeah.
But I think... Sorry, this
is
your story, Teymour.
Well, you're right. It's a great one to kick off the proceedings for this evening. Let's get into the meat.
That's the popular culture.
There you go.
Was the original book called that as well?
Yeah, it was.
Yeah. There you go. Well,
And of course, then there was the big fuss. Sorry, just one final word on this. There was the big fuss about the fact that the guy who wrote it is now in trouble because he moved to the States.
He
when
didn't
he was a young
serve.
man,
Didn't do
and
his
he
national
didn't do his
service.
national service.
Yeah,
But we won't
talk
go
about
into
that. Exactly. Let's brush over that. All right. Okay. Good. Let's kick off. We're going to go to Hong Kong now, and we're going to talk about Hong Kong and talent. This is a really interesting story. Who brought this one up? Was it again you?
Yeah, it was
there
me,
you
yeah.
go.
Tim was busy
Come on,
with
you're
the
just
new-
hogging it tonight.
Who would know that you knew about news?
All right.
Goodness.
Maybe if we can flash up the article on the web on the video screen there. We can have a look at this one. So the Bloomberg article here is basically Hong Kong wants to get top professionals into their city. What's the story here, Teymour?
Well, they've set up this program where they're specifically offering. I'm not going to say preferential treatment. I don't know how they want to characterize it, but they're basically saying this is exactly the kind of talent that we want to come to Hong Kong. These are the areas we've identified, and so far so good. Every country does that, including Singapore. And they've said that the way they've presented it suggests that they are inviting and welcoming people to come to Hong Kong. Now, the reason I say this is for two reasons. Principally because initially the way the Bloomberg article presents it is that they want specifically tech talent. And, all of us here to a greater or lesser extent are involved in technologies and software that we think are part of the future. And we all know that the amount of talent in those spaces is already tight. And there's going to be a battle. There's going to be an enormous tug of war for the really top people in those fields. And Hong Kong has sort of put its marker down and said, we want you over here. Yeah. Which I think is an interesting conversation to have because...
Can we have a look at the list that they've got up here? So
I'd be curious to how deep does the incentives go as well?
Yeah, I think it's 30 points. That's kind of... The list here is... Shall I read it out just in case your eyes can't focus that? So... Waste management specialist.
I did love the fact that was at the top of the list.
Yeah. Asset management specialist, marine insurance professionals, actuaries, fintech, data scientists and cybersecurity, innovation and technology experts. There you go, Scott. You're in there. Yeah. Naval architects, marine engineers, superintendents of ships. That's really specific, isn't it? Creative industries and dispute resolution professionals.
I guess what's interesting, actually, is that given the breadth of those jobs that they want, those expertises that they want, Bloomberg chose to lead on the tech side of it. Tech is only one small element of that whole thing, and Bloomberg chose to highlight that, which I think, again, in a way backs up the point I'm making, is that actually the software and technology development fields and blockchain development fields in particular are areas where everyone is now beginning to say, we have a problem here.
Yeah.
What does a naval architect do?
They design big ships.
There you go.
Massive... Because you're not a designer, you're an architect. Because just the sheer size
master
of those
craft,
things. If you think about the size of a cruise ship, it's just it's a city on the
But
waves.
it's interesting that Hong Kong wants to design ships.
Yeah, I mean it's not exactly like it's got a huge amount of coastline.
It's got a big harbour, but
Yeah.
It's a really.
Hong Kong is the second biggest port in the world.
yeah.
But then again, I suppose this is a difference between designing it versus building it.
Yeah.
I'm guessing you wouldn't want to be building it in Hong Kong, given the cost of labour. But
What was it about that interested you? Was it that, when you looked at what Hong Kong were doing, was that sort of what you thought was a step in the right direction of how government should be, reacting to talent or in recruiting talent? Because the kind of talent we're talking about here are quite mobile, aren't they? They'll go and find the opportunities.
Well, like I say, there were two aspects to it. One was the fact that Bloomberg, and I agree with that, highlighted the fact that tech talent in particular is hard to come by. But secondarily, because we live in Singapore, where the conversation about having qualified immigrants come into the country and be given residency on the basis of their qualifications is a hot topic. And it's a hot topic everywhere, obviously.
Yeah.
But in Singapore, obviously, we've been talking about this for the past 3 years. And I just wondered whether, with Hong Kong laying that down quite so publicly, it might make a difference to the way things are being done here.
Yeah.
I think one of the really interesting bits, especially looking at a lot of that tech talent, is you are very clearly seeing another East versus West battle brewing here. I mean, it's really interesting. The Economist, in the most recent edition, is that the correct word, of their magazine, as they like to call it, talking about the fact that there is a brain drain taking place within Silicon Valley. So they're looking at an awful lot of their top talent is actually now leaving Silicon Valley. And I think what's really interesting is that if you look at an awful lot of the growth of Silicon Valley, there has been a huge amount of talent from places like India from the broader Asian region moving to the US to then build an awful lot of these famous companies. And if you look at the people that are looking after Google and Microsoft, there's a very clear sort of theme in those senior positions. And I think what's really interesting is that over the next decade, we're going to see an awful lot of that talent, instead of it being drawn to the US, whether it's because of the political situation, whether it's because of taxation, whatever it may be. A lot of that... Thanks,
Keep
Barrett.
rolling.
A lot of that is now going to sort of be more focused on this region, whether it is, talent that we're even bringing in from the outside into this part. So whether that is a play from Hong Kong to keep a lot of the local talent, and by local I mean the broader region, within the region, or whether that is actually actively looking to steal from, whether it's Europe or the Americas.
I think they have to be, right?
Well,
Because that kind of talent, I mean, if you were a fintech expert, you could go anywhere, right?
Theoretically,
and you could work anywhere.
But I would
really.
actually argue there's no such thing.
As a fintech expert.
This is one of the
All
dangers.
right, okay, now it's time.
He's had
Go on,
half a glass
Scott.
of wine. He's going to
Lay
get
it
into
down.
the pokies.
But I was going back to the thing, it's like, if you look back and when Singapore really wanted to attract banking talent, 10, 15 years ago, I mean, a lot of that talent came from South Asia. Look at the banks today. There's a strong concentration of certain people of certain nationalities because they respond to messages like what the Hong Kong government's put up. So I think it will see a shift from those nations that can very quickly adjust the output of the education system and produce talent that can feed in.
I think with that as well, it's what the culture champions, and I think what's really interesting about the South Asian sort of subcontinent, if you like, what's really interesting is what that collective culture, and I appreciate that is a very broad generalization. You've got a lot of different cultures within that, but the fact that they are very keen to emphasize things like entrepreneurship, like whatever else, which, you've got certain parts of the US where that is championed as well, but I wouldn't necessarily say as a massively, it's not historically been something that places like Europe, for example, would champion. And I think it's really interesting that you get a cultural story within a place like India where they're very keen to talk about entrepreneurship and the potential that entrepreneurship brings you as an individual, as a family, as all sorts of stuff. And I think where you see countries like Hong Kong then being very public about the fact that they're then saying we want experts of these particular kinds of skills, that then helps to, it starts to shape that cultural conversation quite a lot. And the fact that it starts it is an important part of it. But
compare that, for example, you talk about Hong Kong and Singapore and contrast that, because I guess it's in the same region with Australia, for example. And there's a lot of brain drain going from Australia to Asia, right? As particularly Singapore and Hong Kong, for a number of reasons. And I just find that really fascinating because there's a lot of talent coming out of Australia.
One of the main challenges of the Australian market is the banking sector is quite saturated, so the rate of change in that market is nowhere near as what we're seeing here in Hong Kong and Singapore and surrounding countries. And so you actually get a lot of, let's call it fintech talent for now, coming out of Australia. They've spent some time with big banks or a tech company there and finding opportunity here that's exciting for them.
Why would they choose to leave Australia where, they could get paid very well and comfortable life?
Get paid just as well up here.
And it's
Just
just
as
as
get a lot of
comfortable. And
you
the
get a lot of
tax is
the
a fraction of what it is in
and
Australia.
you get the government grants, you get all the incentives.
Yeah, I mean, there's also, like, for instance, I can only speak the Australian part right now. There's a natural adventure kind of underlying currently. That's why we're going to, the UK for 30 years to live in a garage, to
Such
work
an
at a call
odd
centre.
series of choices.
Yeah.
But you're now seeing more of that coming to this part of the world as well, again, to chase opportunity. Like, Singapore and Hong Kong are very lucky in that they are kind of almost gravitational points for change in this region.
Yeah.
And so if you're someone who's been in the Australian market, it hasn't really changed a lot in 3 decades. It's quite exciting to come and work in Singapore, to spend some time in Jakarta or Manila or Bangkok, these exciting cities.
Will they have an impact on Australia long term if they lose their best entrepreneurial talent? Will that impact Australia tangibly? Because Australia has if you look at the immigration into Australia, it's very much focused on sort of, for example, if I was a diesel mechanic or a nurse, no problem getting an immigration visa into Australia. But if I was an entrepreneur, forget it.
And it's got a lot tighter recently as well.
Yeah, a lot tighter, particularly the 456 visa, which is one that we've been using a lot. It's become a lot tighter to get. But if you look at the Australian education system is still exporting a lot of talent to this part of the world.
Exactly.
I mean, there's still a large amount of Malaysia, Indonesian, Singaporeans that go to Australia for their education. So
I think this whole visa thing is fascinating. I mean, Teymour and I have a long-standing nerdiness around blockchain, and we talked about this recently about whether blockchain would subvert the concept of having a passport or whatever else. But if you look at, there's a country in the Baltics that has now given you that digital visa. It's either
Estonia.
Estonia, is it? You can now apply to get a visa based on the fact that you don't even live there if you have a certain kind of tech talent. I think this global, it's a gold rush for want of another cliche, but this recognition that there are a certain set of skills that are going to bring vast amounts of potential wealth. Sadly, probably only to a select small group of people, because that's the way that a lot of these companies work. It's not like it's going to be distributed evenly amongst everybody. But the really interesting thing is that the talent is so mobile. Yeah. So there's absolutely nothing. We see a lot of this in Singapore, a lot of the great talent that sets up a startup, and then you sort of try and catch up with them 6 months later, and you send them a message, and it's, I'm now living in Bali, and I'm living in this nice little commune in a rice paddy. And it's like, my goodness, because you can do it from just about anywhere. If you've got an internet connection and stable electricity, you can do this anywhere.
Why not?
Why not choose the lifestyle that matches?
Let me flip the conversation a little bit into a slightly different realm about the other big story, I think, in Asia this week, and that is the conversation that's happening in China right now, the China-Africa Forum.
Yeah. It's very similar, isn't it? There's a lot of parallels there.
I mean, I wanted to sort of look at this from a perspective of globalization, because you've got countries like Estonia talking about the global digital nomad, and we've got countries like Singapore and Hong Kong, to a greater or lesser extent, encouraging the movement. But we've also got a counter trend going on in globalization where it's actually being reined back in, right? You can see that from the perspective of Trump bailing out of trade deals across the world. You can see that in terms of the trade wars that are coming along. You can see that even in terms of the fact that Amazon is now stopping shipping things to various countries in the world, whereas before they would ship anything you liked anywhere you liked. Yeah. So there are counter trends going on about that. Some things are becoming increasingly globalized according to what has been happening for a long time. And then we're also seeing a counter trend of narrowing in. And a lot of this seems to be around that dynamic of, what do we do about China? And all the Western media phrase it in that term, right?
Yeah.
What do we do about China? As if China is something that has to be contained. And of course, we live in Asia, and in Asia, you kind of have a disparity of opinion, because you've got, I think the Chinese by and large go, what do you mean? What do you do about China? It's a question of, like, we're just doing our thing. And why is this a problem for you? So that whole conversation, I think, is very interesting.
Do you see it differently now that you're here than, for example, if you were in the UK or Australia, looking, through that lens at what China's doing? Have you got a different attitude toward it? Do you think you're sort of more open-minded about it?
That's not a question of being open-minded. It's a question of what narrative that you choose to believe is true.
Yeah.
Right. And if you've grown up your entire life in Australia, for instance, you read the Sydney Morning Herald or listen to the ABC, watch the ABC at night, you'll come away with a sense of the world is a certain way. And if you grew up in Beijing, you come up with a sense the world is completely different. And if you spend most of your life traveling around like I've done, partly because of parental movement and partly out of choice, then you kind of end up not really having one perspective or another. So you sit there and just go, okay, it's all in conflict, which effectively is where I sit.
It's the bit that fascinates me. It's that story that you get told by the media that were available to you at the point when you were growing up. And I think we've talked about this previously.
Narratives.
When I moved to Singapore, and especially when I started spending time up in China, I had been, I'll say it, I've been brainwashed by Western media to expect that every person that I met on the streets of China was just waiting to overthrow the government. And then when I got there to realize that the Chinese people were incredibly proud of being Chinese, it sounds ridiculous me saying it now. It always makes me sound like I'm an incredibly stupid individual. But it's like, oh my God, of course, this is exactly the way that they would feel. And then to then go back and listen to the way that people that I grew up with talk about Asia generally, and to be like, oh my goodness, it's because you've only ever been given that one side of the story. And propaganda, I mean, genuinely, getting here and discovering that a lot of what I perceived about Asia was complete nonsense because of the way they'd been reflected in the media was such a shock.
And the comment that was made by the China Foreign Ministry spokesperson this week at the China-Africa Forum, which I think is... I sent to you. I don't know if you got it available.
You got that little sort of graphic with the lady's comment. It's brilliant.
Yeah. I don't know if you got it.
Yeah.
No pressure, Barat. Find that graphic.
Don't worry about it. Describe it to us, Teymoor, for those podcast listeners who don't have the benefit of video.
But effectively what she was saying was, it's interesting how in Western media the narrative, and obviously this is completely paraphrasing everything, she was saying that the narrative in Western media is when the West lends other countries money, it's called aid, and it's portrayed as a positive and altruistic and benevolent kind of activity. When China does it, it's called trying to take control of the other country and make them subservient. And you know, there are multiple dimensions to this conversation, but it is interesting how the narratives from the media are different.
But I think going back to our last talent one, this is where I find interesting. So 10 years ago, I had my very first trip to China, and I was in Beijing in a hotel, and I watched a documentary that linked the Dalai Lama to Adolf Hitler. You can imagine the timing, like what was happening around politically then, because in terms of the country. But 10 years later, you know, me and my colleagues are constantly doing tech tours of Shenzhen from Hong Kong and seeing a very, very different China. And so the perception is changing in different pockets, in different trends, depend on our own individual selfish interest.
Yeah.
And now you go to England and the UK media are portraying Jeremy Corbyn as Adolf Hitler.
So I occasionally look at news.com.au being an Australian. And all it is which reality TV star has the next drug addiction or mental breakdown, and that's mainstream news in Australia.
This is Western media generally, though. This is the same in the UK and in the US, and this is what worries me: is that they've got to a stage where the average person on the street does not know about what's going on, even outside of the world of the reality TV. And I know I'm
That's
saying
why
like a patronising old man, right?
This links back nicely to
show.
our very first, back to Crazy Rich Asians.
Yeah.
Are they more worried about audience size than the actual quality of the narrative itself?
What's the
Like,
answer?
is this the question? Are they more worried about how many clicks, how many adverts they can sell, than actually any strength of news quality at all?
I think we know the answer to that one, right? All right, let's move on. Let's move on that.
Saving us from the...
and we have from this veritable source, Channel News Asia, our next story coming up. Let's talk about talent. Talk about Singapore. This is fascinating. So this is one that you brought up, Simon.
Yes.
Yeah,
So
tell us
this-
about this.
So this is building on, I suppose, a very similar sort of story to
So
what...
maybe you can read the headline first for those that
Sorry.
aren't watching the video.
This is 10,000 people in Singapore to be taught AI basics for free. And we're going to unpack a little bit this because there's an awful lot of really interesting elements to those 10,000. But I thought this was a really interesting build on Teymour's story about the sort of the different talent that Hong Kong is looking for. So I suppose, you know, Hong Kong is looking to bring in talent from the outside. Singapore has a long history of doing that too. But they're now really interestingly looking to educate a lot of the existing talent within the country, or not even talent, just people living in the country. What is most fascinating to me about this story is that the 10,000 that they're looking to train in AI basics are from primary school age children right the way through to old age pensioners. They're not restricting this by any age group. And I think what is absolutely brilliant about that is that it is making one of the most important technologies in the world today accessible to the general population. Now, making it available for free to those 10,000 people. Obviously, within that, you're going to get some people that just go along for the entertainment value. They've got nothing else to do. But then you've also got a significant number of people that are going to come along. They're going to learn something, and it's going to spark ideas that they're going to be able to turn into tangible businesses or things that they can sell, whatever else it may be. And the idea that they're making this accessible to the older community within Singapore is, it fascinates me, because the conversation around AI at the moment goes in one or two directions. It either goes with the, isn't it amazing what technology can do, or, oh my God, it's going to take all our jobs and human beings are going to be redundant. And this takes a very much more practical view of, this stuff is here to stay. It's going to evolve incredibly rapidly. We can either have a tantrum or pretend that nothing is wrong, or we can actually get involved in it and start training our people so that they can do stuff around it. So there's two elements to this. There's the 10,000 people that they'll train for free in the basics. There's then also 2,000 people that they will provide very much more in-depth industry-related training on AI for, which they'll charge $500 for, but they'll also provide significant amounts of government funding for pretty much anybody that can't afford that. So all of a sudden, artificial intelligence, together with the blockchain stuff that Teymour was talking about earlier, I mean, if you look at those two technologies, they have the potential to disrupt every single element of life as we know it, and even to the extent of disrupting biology. So if you think about AI, the potential of what that could mean for the future of human bodies and whatever else. I mean, this genuinely is
You've been
going to
watching
change.
Transcendence too much.
But you see, this is the
He's drunk the Kool-Aid.
the science fiction element of it. When I sit down and I talk to the folks that are building this kind of stuff, and I go, holy shit, this is not like it was when I was watching Star Trek as a kid, when it's like, this is all imaginary future stuff. Pretty much anything you can imagine people are working on right now. So there are companies that I have been looking at over the last few days that are very, very seriously investing in how do you download your brain. Now, I know that sound, to us sitting around this table, that seems obvious because that's kind of the world that we live in. But if I speak to my mum about that, her face is just this kind of, why would you want
Right, so go back to the point
So
about
back to
training
AI.
old people, AI, coding, right? So these are coding workshops. When you read this story,
Theoretically.
what was the feelings that you had rather than the analysis? Was it a good thing?
Oh, definitely.
Yeah.
I get really excited, especially we're going to train everybody, because this idea that you're going to lose your job to a robot is all of a sudden it's like, screw that.
Yeah.
Singapore's got it right. Instead of
We're
that,
going to make even more robots.
some people around the world will lose their jobs to
Yeah.
a robot. They already are, and yet
But
Singapore's take on that
the whole
is...
point of this and the whole raft of other measures that they brought on outside of just software and
Yeah.
AI and stuff like that is the idea of lifelong intelligence. I've done probably close to a dozen shows on local media about these government initiatives, and it's a great thing. I mean, this is what the Singapore government has
magic.
done so well for so long, is recognized or at least covered its bases on multiple trends.
Make it accessible, right?
and trying to make sure that it's got the future covered at least partially without committing itself.
Well, I'm going to volunteer my own time to work on the first AI in Hawker Centre project.
Oh, totally.
How would that work?
I have no idea.
How are you going to digitalize the
Yeah.
whole fun man?
Oh, but
fun,
it's not to replace the chef, but it's to get rid of an awful lot of the other stuff, like collecting the trays. I'm sure we...
Yeah.
Well, they've tried
payment-
some of
the
that, and
payments.
it's not gone down well. The Hawker community likes the way things are, right?
Yeah. But I think that what's fascinating is that, talking of the payments piece, when you've got things like Grab that have brought in different kinds of changes to that, it's amazing how quickly technology is jumped on when
Yeah.
it makes small bits of everyday life better.
Yeah.
And I think that's what's really nice about a lot of these activities, is it's making it accessible to the everyday. And a lot of the people that are going to turn up to this are not the sorts of people that are going to sit down and go, I'm going to build the next Tesla. They're going to go, how could I use... you're going to get a lot of garage tinkerers. They're going to build things that do clever stuff for their own benefit. And that's where magic really comes from. I'm fully expecting we're going to get one or two Teslas as well. But it is that, how do we automate some stuff at the Hawker Centre? How do we get better at all these little mundane things that frustrate us in everyday life?
And some really simple use cases which keep coming up. So, there's, in the news, things like SCDF is trying to optimize resources. So where do they put critical emergency resources for our population in a space where every square foot is now allocated? Where does an ambulance go? How do you respond to a potential crisis in Jurong? This is where it could help.
So I was spending some time with the guys at Alibaba recently. They were telling me about, they've got a piece of technology that it's AI stuff that goes inside an ambulance, and the ambulance speaks to the traffic grid that controls all the traffic lights, and basically from where the accident is, as soon as it sets off, it sets every single traffic light to green on the way to the hospital, so it doesn't need to slow down.
Not immediately, it's sequentially, but yeah.
Yeah, sorry, you know what I mean. So on the route, as it gets to it, absolutely right.
Have they actually tested that?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
And it's reduced the amount of time that it takes the average ambulance to get from the scene of an accident to the hospital by 50%. Now, if you look at...
And what has it done for the
Well,
average journey time of the rest of
for
the
everybody else.
billion cars on the
But
road?
They're all doubled.
to save lives, though, I mean, some people lose, some people win, and that's it. You've got the ambulance chasers that are going to get where they want to get to a lot quicker. But I think when you look at what the technology can do, and when you apply it in that level, it's going to save lives, it's going to cost jobs. It's our job as the sorts of people that are influencing this kind of industry and that are getting involved in these conversations to make sure that we focus more on the benefits that it can bring, right?
Well, there was a really cool use case actually in Tokyo. When you think about, first response is the most critical thing when it comes to the ambulance service. And so based on natural language analysis, if they had certain things like heart attack, poison, those kind of things came up, and they already knew that the traffic to get that to that location from an available resource would be longer than the critical time, they have drones that could say, here is what's the defibrillator, EpiPens, they have it on standby that could fly over things.
It's just brilliant.
But also automatically bypassing air traffic control regulation Like that's pretty cool stuff. If you can send a defibrillator faster than an ambulance can get there to save somebody's life, that's pretty cool.
I mean, the number of times you hear about the 911 calls where there's like a kid that is administering some kind of life-saving activity with guidance from somebody on the phone. You know, having those extra tools where it's, there are certain elements of first aid where you can do more damage than good, but for the most part, it's just knowing what to do in the right moment. And whether it's a drone, whatever it may be. Yeah, I mean, these things are brilliant. So,
do you think when you look at what's going on here in Asia, I mean, you've talked about China, we talked about Japan, we talked about Singapore, that for observers from the outside, there's a real case, isn't there, that sort of very top-down approach to planning smart cities and, technology, and it has a case, right? But you can see that actually to make this work, you kind of have to kind of get everybody together consensus-wise and, like you say, air traffic control, like urban planning and so on. You've got to sort of package all that together where, if you go to America, everything's state by state, even the driving laws, right, state by state. So that's where driverless cars sort of are struggling to kind of keep up with it. I
partially agree with this. If you spend enough time in Shenzhen, you realize that the Chinese hunger in potential, like the mindset of them, it's 5 times what the US mindset is.
What do you mean by that, the hunger?
Like they just turn around, they can turn around things faster, more hungry, more efficiently than you can get in the US right now. Like everyone goes on about Silicon Valley. I'm like, forget Silicon Valley. I'd rather go to Shenzhen to get a prototype on my next.
The only difference between those two is that Shenzhen is not nearly as good as PR as
I get
right.
that.
Yeah, the storytelling part is like lacking, isn't it? Yeah. Like Jack Ma versus Steve Jobs.
The quality of innovation out of Shenzhen is insane.
Yeah.
But I'm going to provoke. I know that you're going to respond to this. But my take on the top-down thing, it's not really the top-down versus democracy, whatever else problem. The reality is that most Western governments have failed in their quest for democracy because all they've ended up doing is they've ended up arguing with each other. Yeah. If I look at politics in the UK, it's not whether or not there's a good idea, it's whether the idea belongs to the party that you support. And so if the ruling party versus the opposition, if the ruling party come up with a great idea, it doesn't matter how good it is, the opposition will automatically say it's wrong because it's not their idea, and it just ends up in squabbling. The difference in an awful lot of these top-down sort of economies or countries, whatever you want to call it, is not that there's not democracy. The difference is that shit just gets done without argument. Shit gets done,
there you go. That's often the comparison between China and India, isn't it? Like why just one has sort of got ahead and the others...
Fucking arguing about it.
All right, well, let's move on that note.
Are we not allowed to talk politics again this week? I was just
there you go. Just on that note. And the last story of the evening brought to us by Scott. This could be interesting. So I've just shared that on. This is, I don't know if you got the link there, Barrett. Maybe you can get this one up on Chrome. It's the first step towards responsible AI one. Is that the one that you want to go with?
Yeah, so let's just start. So one of the things I'm hoping we can get past in the near future, and this actually links to the skills one as well, is that a lot of AI, blockchain, and so forth today is done for the sake of innovation theatre. It's done for PR reasons. It's done for how can we put it on a new frock?
Raising vast amounts of money through an ICO.
Yeah. And so I'm hoping that we can move to some kind of moral compass that allows the true potential of these technologies to actually come through. And that's the hard part, is that how do we find a way to get beyond buzzwords in the press and massive ICOs so that we can actually...
The ICO thing in particular really frustrates me. I think you look at blockchain and its massive, massive potential, and yet all you've ended up with is hype about ICOs, hype about cryptocurrencies and all the dangers that came with that, and people have missed what the potential of the tech is. So yeah, I'm totally with you on this one. I think it's a really important story.
All right, let me take the other side of that conversation then.
Right, has he delivered this side first?
There are two on that side. I'm just, it's kind of new technology in any context throughout the world, through any era, is a socially disruptive force, right? Yeah. So the ICOs, the noise, the nonsense that we're talking about now is just an attendant consequence of change, right? I don't think that we can do anything about it, and I don't think that it's necessarily something that we should worry about. Actually, it's more important to make sure that we don't move too fast, isn't it? Because if we deploy things that are not ready, we have the danger of making things worse, don't we?
Yeah.
Particularly in terms of artificial intelligence, stuff that we don't really understand that has incredibly disruptive power. Yeah. If we put that stuff in there for commercial reasons, just because we want to beat a market first or something, we have the potential of causing an enormous amount of problems.
Oh, I don't disagree with that, but I don't think those two things are in conflict.
Yeah, because I think I would actually agree in that. So, for instance, the underlying potential of blockchain technology is actually amazing.
Yeah.
But actually, the core community that's driving blockchain right now are not bringing the masses with them. They're positioning themselves as the cowboy on the outside that's going to change the world and solve world peace in 5 minutes.
And it
that
is
actually
cowboy,
that could
particularly.
actually cannibalize the end value of the technology. That's what's frustrating.
That's the worry, is that you end up with it being associated with all the negatives rather than the potential. I think that's where. So
Well, I mean, all I'm saying is that one way or another, whoever you choose to blame or whoever, whichever party you think is doing it correctly or wrongly, it will follow the pattern that everything follows. You know, the Gardner hype cycle and stuff. I mean, things do tend to work in cycles. So at some point, however much noise we make on one side or the other, at this point in the game, the cycle will play itself out in the way that it normally does, right? And we'll sit here and have this conversation 10, 15 years from now and say, yeah, well, you know, we got to where we thought we were going to get, and maybe it took a little bit longer, maybe it took a little bit quicker.
You're a big advocate of blockchain generally, aren't you?
Yeah. I mean, I like the technology, and I like a lot of the conversations that we're having around it, for sure.
Okay, so how do we then move beyond because I think Scott's point's absolutely valid, that you look at, maybe this is another one of those media issues where the stories that are getting told about this in the general sort of, you know, the Daily Mail story of, oh my God, blockchain broke everything because it stole our currency. How do we get past these, I'm going to say it, how do we get past these idiots that are ruining the stories and not telling the important stuff? How does somebody like you tell the important story, Teymoor?
Well, who are the idiots? I mean, in many ways, I'm one of the idiots because I'm talking about it without being fully aware and understanding of the technology. This is complicated stuff, and I have a grasp. I have a couple of fingers in the pie, but I don't present myself as any kind of an expert.
No, but you're also,
how do you have these conversations?
You're also not the tabloid journalist that's trying to scandalise Mabel in Gateshead about the potential of this technology to ruin her local corner store. I mean, it's like, this is the bit that worries me, is that we go straight into
we've had that forever. And I mean, you're talking about the UK tabloid press, which have been a disruptive and ridiculous force for decades.
Western, generally. I mean, you've got this across Europe and the US as well. I mean, fortunately, we have a little bit, whether I'm just sheltered from it, we seem to have less of that in Asia. Maybe I'm wrong.
Is the answer to train 10,000 people on AI?
Potentially, yeah. Right, but I think what's really interesting
Raise
is
the level of knowledge.
If your 70-year-old mother-in-law has decided she's going to go and learn about how to do AI because she keeps hearing people talk about it, and then all of her neighbours say, "Oh, you're doing that AI thing," it's very difficult then for some provocative journalist to try and do the clickbait thing that you were referring to earlier, where they're going to get a lot more advertising revenue by scandalising Mabel in Gateshead. I think this is what's really interesting, is by making it accessible and by offering it to the masses, all of a sudden you completely debase all of the fear.
Yeah, hopefully.
What kind of interests me, and you might be in a good position to talk about this, Scott, because you talk to people about their approach to digitalization. Now, last year IBM put out a report about corporate attitudes towards digitalization. KPMG this year, in fact, a couple of weeks ago, did a big survey on blockchain. And the conclusion seems to be that in the KPMG context, which I remember because it was only a couple of weeks ago, they said 80% of C-suite companies with C-suite officials in companies were actively involved in looking at blockchain because they recognized that they needed to do so. The rate of uptake and the rate of understanding about change and the need to transform themselves seems to be much, much quicker than it was 20 years ago when,
for the web,
when the internet first turned up on the web. Everyone was very slow.
So
on
actually,
I don't know if you see that in your work.
So actually, I was prepping this just today for an event tomorrow, where the number's up to 84%, as reported by IDC. So 84% of regional boards are now saying that some form of digital transformation is essential to the future of their company. The challenge, though, is that the actualization of that is actually less than 2% of them are actually doing what was intended.
They're
doing the face and the PR side, but most people forget that your bank still runs on 40-year-old code, despite the fact they're telling you
the ATM. It's like it works on Windows 95.
Yeah, I mean, no, people are still using Windows Vista and these things, aren't they? Yeah. It's amazing. But actually, there was an interesting story today. HSBC have set up their own online bank experiment. Did you see that?
So Stan Chart's got one in Hong Kong, HSBC's got one.
in
Australia.
What do you mean online?
Well, they're actually setting up a completely separate bank,
But haven't they done that
which is
with
online
Smile
only.
or something?
No, I mean they've incorporated online components into their banking technology. But when you set up, and this is how it should be done. I think I don't know as a digital tech expert. When you transform, there's no point in incremental change. You either have to jump in feet first or miss the boat. Really.
The challenge in, let's call it digital transformation for the sake of the discussion, is you actually have to acknowledge your current state and your desired future state and what the journey looks like. It's going from the current state to the future state that's the hardest part. The future state's not actually that hard. Because if you look at the mindset and the tech stack of an Amazon or a Facebook and so forth, which are, basically 10-year-old companies that don't have 40, 50 years of legacy that they drag along, they just started with a clean slate. And so most of the companies that I'm dealing in particularly are realizing that a clean slate is far more effective as a way of actually transforming.
No legacy. Haven't we seen that? I mean, it's interesting where we are in Asia, particularly when we look at healthcare and medical tourism. Like if you go to a place like Thailand, which obviously is, until recently, it hasn't been renowned for healthcare, how it's positioned itself. Like if you walk into the Bangkok hospital, for example,
stunning.
They build it around this idea that you are a customer and you're here to have some kind of like something fixed or something like tested or whatever. Yeah. Whereas, it's starting with a clean slate. Like let's build a hospital around a customer.
And I think if you come, and this is what fascinates me, is I remember when I came back, I was living in Bangkok and I went back to the UK and I was...
What were you doing in Bangkok again?
I was taking some time out. And I remember saying to some friends that I'd been into... So I've been snorkeling and I'd had an incident with a sea urchin and I'd had to go...
It's not an infection, was it? Simon had
an incident with a sea urchin.
Right. So anyway, I got into the hospital. I remember...
Is that a euphemism, do you think?
I'm glad I started talking about this.
All right.
So I walk into this hospital. Basically, I get treated, I get seen, I walk out within, I think it was about 40 minutes from the moment I walked into having everything done, all the checks, all the medicine and stuff like that. I remember going back to the UK and saying, and I had to go to a hospital in Bangkok, and everybody went, I was like, I'm terribly sorry, folks, but with all respect to the NHS and the challenges that they face, hospitals in Bangkok versus hospitals in the UK, I will choose a hospital in Bangkok almost every time because it doesn't have the legacy issues to deal with. I think this comes back to that getting shit done point of we think because of the propaganda we're told that we've got these amazing institutions, but what we're missing is that there are better ways of doing the actual implementation of the idea. So something like the NHS as a system is brilliant, but the way it gets implemented in Asia is so much more effective.
So I do a lot of work with a lot of Thai accelerators at the moment, and I think we've done probably 24 medical tourism startups in the last 5 years. At the core of it is go back to our talent debate. They're all foreign doctors. And what they do is they do what they call a procedural experience. And so you'll have a really good knee surgeon, a really good plastic surgeon, a really good dental surgeon, a really good cardiac surgeon. So you've got all these guys with their specialties, but they use the Thai tourism experience around them to make coming to this knee surgeon the best knee surgeon on the planet as an experience. There is no cold waiting room. There is no terrible hotel food. You're in a 5-star hotel with massage available to you. Like that's the experience of going to hospital in Thailand now.
Admittedly, it's not available to everybody, so I think we need to be
realistic. The elephant in the room is the cost.
But have you seen how what they're going after? They're literally just going after what we call the underinsured markets of Asia.
Yeah.
So they're going like the wealthy parts of Myanmar, the wealthy parts of Vietnam, China, Singapore, and go, you know what? Instead of paying for insurance in your home country, come here.
And it's huge. In places like Singapore, the amount of money, Singapore Tourism Board has a particular bit of its, is focused on bringing in those medical tourists. It's just fascinating how big an industry it is in this part of the world.
And that's why Asia matters.
Smooth segue.
There you go.
Nice wrap.
Well, gentlemen, thank you so much for being such good guests on version 1, episode 1 of Asia Matters in this roundtable format.
Is it over already?
It is over. I know.
We're at 48 minutes.
48 minutes. Time flew whilst you're having fun.
It did.
And hopefully, if you enjoyed watching at home, share the comments, share your thoughts, anything that you want to take up issue with, then feel free to flame the guests.
Totally.
I'm just here to host the show. So all the comments, none of these opinions are mine, by the way. So I'm just here to facilitate the debate. But
so full of it.
Teymoor Nabili, thank you so much for coming today and actually wearing your headphones properly.
Yay!
Simon Kemp.
Thanks, Graham.
And Scott Bales.
Thanks, Graham.
Great to have you here. And
thanks to Barrett as well.
The 3 very opinionated chaps in the scene, but we seem to have kind of like hit a stride today, a wavelength.
We
I
didn't
think.
offend too many people.
Yeah, it's good. I think people
Police waiting
appreciate.
outside.
Yeah, there you go. Exactly. It's all fun and games until the camera turns off. Hey, AsiaMatters.show is the new URL, which will be hosting
the
all the
URL as well.
There you go.
Boom.
So yeah, we're on the the program to push this out every week, every Tuesday evening. New faces, maybe some of will be a repeat. So come back on the show, please, and share your opinions, bring new stories.
Right.
And if you're watching this on YouTube, then please share any stories that you would like to hear in the future. Just drop us a URL. If you're following on LinkedIn, likewise. And if you're listening on iTunes on the podcast, you can tweet us, #AsiaMatters, and we'll pick it up. So any great
Nice.
stories this week in Asia, we'd like to know, and we'll be happy to share our opinion because, we're not afraid to share our opinions here. We don't need to have our arms twisted. It's easy. So this is us from the Asia Tech Podcast Studio in Singapore signing off. Thank you very much.
Thanks all.
Good night.